Today, we become legends.
Smite 2's aspects have a problem. Well, some of them do. Aspects as a whole is a huge W and a really cool system, allowing existing mains of a god to play them in a new way, or even bringing in players who didn't really love the base kit but enjoy the way the aspect plays. It's a really awesome system and probably my favourite addition to Smite 2 that makes it feel so different and better than Smite 1. However, the way some aspects are designed and balanced currently leaves something to be desired. Let's go through every aspect in Smite 2 and identify which are great, which are workable with balance changes, and which are just fundamentally bad designs. There are currently 24 aspects in Smite 2, with the long-term plan being every god having at least one, with the potential for multiple on some gods if they have enough open design space to explore. First up, we have Anhur's aspect, which I think is a decent design but falls into a common trap with aspects. This one doesn't shift Anhur's role or playstyle enough to form a unique niche in itself, and therefore will end up being either outright better or outright worse than the base kit. In Anhur's case, the aspect is just better, and therefore there's not really any reason to use base Anhur anymore because both options fill the same playstyle. If one is just better in that case, then that's all that will get used. The aspect design in itself I think is pretty cool, and if they go ahead with the change of letting his abilities crit, then it will be even cooler, but also even more of a reason to never use base Anhur again unless they give his base kit something else too. Next up is Ares' aspect, which is a newer one, and I think this is pretty fine overall. It's not that much of a playstyle shift really, but it does at least offer a slightly different way to play Ares, and there is merit to both forms in this case. Though I do think the aspect could use some nerfs or more likely buffs to Ares' base kit to make it more competitive with the aspect, as currently going the aspect is just better no matter where you play him, which goes against the core design goal of aspects. Next up is Athena, which I think is one of the best designed aspects we have so far. It truly is a playstyle and role shift that you won't really want in support, but can be incredibly powerful in jungle, mid, or solo for Athena. Balance-wise, I think it's in a decent spot now as well, after they added Athena getting the shield on landing, but it could maybe even do a small amount of damage on landing as well and probably still be balanced. Much less than base Athena ult, but just a little bit so it would allow it to proc item effects and do a little bit of extra. Overall, really good design though. Bacchus aspect I think is fine. It's not very exciting in my opinion, but it does offer a fairly significant role shift that makes you build differently and have different strengths. A bit boring in my opinion, but not really a problem design wise or balance wise. Bellona aspect is okay as well. It's an interesting shift, but at the moment does fall into the trap of just being mostly better than the base kit the majority of the time. The sacrifice of losing bludgeon's bonus damage is just not enough of a drawback for what you gain with this aspect, and overall I think it's not really that exciting either. Bellona does see reliable play both with and without the aspect though, which is a mark of at least decent success, so I don't have much of a problem with this one other than it being a bit boring. Cernunnos aspect is another one that's a crazy shift and probably the most playstyle shifting aspect we have at the moment. I mean, it literally turns a ranged hunter into a melee assassin / bruiser. That's really interesting. Currently, it's just not very good outside of very specific setups where if you can hit multiple gods at once with your dash, it literally has no cooldown. That's very hard to set up in a real match though, and overall this aspect is extremely weak. Great design though, and I think with some small additional buffs, it can be one of the greats. Chaac aspect is another that I like a lot. Losing the healing from rain is a big downside, but being able to create massive zoning areas of damage is a big upside, and this does shift his playstyle substantially as he can't rely on consistent healing to stay alive. So generally, aspect Chaac is played more as a damage heavy bruiser assassin kind of god, which is interesting for sure. Good aspect. Cupid aspect is also pretty good in my opinion. It's a significant playstyle shift, and I think the main reason it doesn't see too much use is simply because Cupid support isn't very good, even with the aspect. Perhaps they could make one more change to it and it might be genuinely a viable option, but even right now it sees passable usage numbers, and I think it's overall a pretty successful aspect design. Danzaburou's aspect is pretty good design-wise, I think. Balance-wise, it's pretty useless at the moment as the drawback of losing your only base kit CC is just too much. The no DR jar is iconic for Danza in the amount of CC and safety it gives him, and losing that just for some extra clone benefits is usually not worth it, even in a clone-focused build. This one can be fixed with some buffs to the aspect though, and design-wise, I think it's good. Fenrir aspect is very similar actually. I like the design of it, trading some damage for utility to shift him into more of a supportive role, but he's historically found a lot of success. It just needs some buffs, as right now even Fenrir support doesn't use the aspect, and it's simply worse than base Fenrir no matter how or where you're playing him. Geb aspect is interesting, but I think it falls into a similar situation as Danzaburou. Losing such a critical CC on Shockwave doesn't justify the benefit of the increased AoE and cooldown refund. Design-wise, I think it's fine though, and some buffs to the aspect could fix this one fairly easily. Hecate aspect is good in my opinion. It is a big playstyle shift as mid lane Hecate relies heavily on the high burst damage from Spell Eater, and so you're only really using this aspect in support or solo Hecate builds, which I think is an interesting shift and pretty balanced. Not too much to complain about here really. Hercules aspect is a bit of a miss for me though. I respect the idea of shifting him more towards support as he has been successful there historically, but it's just a bit boring, and losing the burst healing from his 3 kind of takes away a large part of Herc's identity for not much benefit. This one could be fixed by buffing the aspect, but overall I think it's just very unexciting, and I wouldn't be mad if they just cooked up something new for Herc. It sees basically no use, and even support Herc is better off going no aspect right now. Hun Batz aspect is up next, which was sort of the inspiration for this video, and one of the most crystallized examples of an aspect just being a better version of the base kit in all roles. He's a new release as of writing, so we don't have aspect usage data for him, but from my own anecdotal experience, it has to be at least 80% regardless of where you're playing him. The aspect is just better. Design-wise, I think it can work, but there needs to be a larger sacrifice than just a tiny bit of damage to give him a giant AoE 8-second cooldown stun. This is kind of the crux of the problem with quite a few aspects. You really don't want to end up in a situation where the aspect is just the obvious choice no matter the playstyle or role. That's not what the system intends to do, and Hun Batz is the best example of that right now. However, some nerfs to the aspect could make this one workable. Khepri aspect is up next, which I think is kind of fine, but could use some work in my opinion. At the moment, it's just very unexciting, and it's also just better than base Khepri no matter the role. Losing the pull is basically a negligible downside, and you just add a bunch of damage to the ability for free. I do think this aspect can work though. They would just need to make some alterations to other areas of the kit, like maybe taking away the revive and make his ult mark an enemy to take increased damage and execute them below a certain threshold or something like that. That way you're probably never running the aspect on support Khepri, as losing the revive is too huge, and it shifts the aspect into a more aggressive damage role. It doesn't have to be exactly this change, but at the moment this aspect is pretty boring, and you just turn it on in every role because it's simply better than base Khepri. Loki aspect is one I just don't think really works. The downside is massive and the upside can be massive, but very often is way too hard to use. You can't use it in solo lane as it's useless in the laning phase, and losing the damage on Vanish is too big of a downside for solo Loki, and support Loki won't be viable regardless of this change. Maybe Loki mid could use it to double gank with their jungler, but you still have the issue of doing very little damage without Vanish if you're going for a full damage Loki build. I think giving Loki more of a solo lane bruiser focused aspect would find more success, as currently this aspect is the least used in the entire game, and for good reason. It simply doesn't work as a design. Mordred aspect is up next, and it's another one that's a bit of a failed design in my opinion. Not because the aspect isn't good or fun, but actually because the aspect is too good and too fun without being a playstyle shift. In stark contrast to Loki, Mordred's aspect is the most used in the entire game at over 96% usage, which is clearly a problem. Especially because the other 4% is probably new players not even knowing that aspect exists, or people who misclick in the lobby. There's literally no reason to ever use base Mordred again since the aspect launched, as it's the same playstyle but just better, both in terms of power level and in terms of fun. This should just become Mordred's base kit, and they should give him a new aspect that maybe focuses him more on a damage role, as he currently isn't very viable with full damage and is mostly a solo lane bruiser or tank. Neith aspect is pretty fine overall, I think. It's a bit unexciting, but does shift her enough in my opinion to be considered a successful aspect. Its usage is solid but not overbearing, and there's a real difference between aspect attack speed Neith and non-aspect ability burst Neith. So overall, I like this aspect. It's not very flashy, but it does shift her enough and is used enough to be considered a success in my opinion. Nemesis aspect is also pretty good. This is one of the few aspects in the game that isn't really a role shift, but does offer enough of a playstyle shift to be a viable alternative without just outright being better than base Nemesis. It explores interesting design space and is pretty balanced compared to base Nemesis, with a solid trade-off for a solid return. Good design overall with decent but not overbearing usage. Ra aspect is a very interesting one. On launch, this was one of the least fun things to play against in solo lane ever, but I think on a design standpoint, the aspect is really fun and does shift his playstyle successfully. I think the main problem lies in Ra's 2, not the aspect itself, and some significant nerfs have already hit Ra's 2 to make it less oppressive with a tank build and stronger with a full damage build. At this point, we are starting to see full damage mid-Ra eclipse tanky aspect solo Ra in usage, but both are still plenty viable, so I think after the balance changes, this aspect can be considered a success in my book, and it's a ton of fun to use. Sobek aspect is very new, and honestly I haven't really played much with it, but I think it falls into a similar category as Nemesis, as just an alternative way to do similar things than base Sobek. I think it's a little unexciting, as all it really does is turn a pull into a push, and it currently sees very low usage, mainly because Sobek is more of a support nowadays, and this aspect isn't great in support. It's probably better in solo or jungle. I do think it has some potential in solo and isn't a terrible design in my opinion, just a bit boring. Thanatos is another one of the aspects that sort of inspired this video and is very similar to Hun Batz aspect right now. I think the idea behind it, turning Thanatos into a bruiser or tank with infinite health stacking, is really interesting. However, in terms of balance at the moment, aspect Thanatos is just better no matter how or where you play Thana, and that's a problem. As mentioned, that's not the goal of aspects, and I think any aspect with more than 70 to 80% usage is a problem. Thanatos sits at 85%, which is not good. However, I don't think the design is unworkable, and I actually think it's really interesting. It just needs to be nerfed into a position where base Thanatos is competitive with it, at least for jungle. 85% aspect usage on Thanatos solo makes sense. 85% aspect usage on Thanatos jungle is a problem in my opinion. The Morrigan is up next, which is somewhat similar to Nemesis in that it doesn't really shift her role at all, but does offer an interesting playstyle shift over base Morrigan within the same role. Its usage stats are fine and indicate there's reasons to go base Morrigan as well as reasons to go aspect. I do think aspects in this vein can work. Not every aspect has to shift a god into a different role. You can also be successful at just changing the playstyle or offering a different way to play within the same role. Though this can be more difficult to balance and leads more often to issues like Mordred aspect where one is just better than the other. Morrigan doesn't seem to fall into this trap, however, as both base Morrigan and aspect Morrigan see consistent usage, so good success overall with this aspect. And finally, for now at least, we have Vulcan aspect, which I think is also fine. This one is a bit more of a role shift with it emphasizing tanky turret-based Vulcan as opposed to squishy burst damage ability-based Vulcan, and I think its usage stats are perfectly acceptable. Vulcan almost has an aspect built into his passive with the mod system, so I don't think its actual aspect needs to be anything too crazy or complicated, and this isn't. I think it works well. So that leaves us with these categorizations in my book. Loki and Mordred are the only two in my opinion that need completely replacing. Loki's just doesn't work and Mordred's will never not be a better version of his base kit in the same role and playstyle. Then we have a good chunk in the category where I think the design is good and can work, but there needs to be some serious balance adjustments. Some of these are just way too strong and always better than the base kit, like Batz, Thanatos, Ares, and Khepri, and some are way too weak with no reason to use them over the base kit, like Cernunnos, Danzaburou, Fenrir, Geb, and Hercules. But I think the biggest problem aspects and inspirations for this video are Thanatos and Hun Batz. These two aspects are just so much better than the base kit for very little trade-off, and need some serious nerfs if we are ever to see base kit Hun Batz or Thanatos in serious lobbies again. Luckily, we only have 2 aspects out of 24 so far that I think are completely unworkable and need to be scrapped. Interestingly, they're both on opposite ends of the spectrum. Loki's aspect fundamentally doesn't work and sees next to no usage, while Mordred's aspect fundamentally works too well and will always be a better version of his base kit. Simply delete Loki aspect and give him a new one, and make Mordred's aspect into his base kit and give him a new one as well. The rest in the good design but needs balancing category are fixable in my opinion, so overall 22 out of 24 or 92% of aspects released so far are workable in my opinion, which is a good sign going forward. They just need to work on balancing this chunk of them more effectively and learning from those mistakes going forward for future aspect designs. What do you think though? Is Loki aspect actually OP and should stay? Let me know down below and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day and peace out, you nerds.